If you could improve your software development productivity by 2 to 3 times, would that matter? If you could figure out how to start saying yes to all the things that your organization has figured out how to say no to all the time, would that make a difference to your business? What if you decided all of this FlowCon stuff was just too complex, too hard, can't be done, but your competitors decided to embrace a transformation and change how they do all of their development practices and got the 2 to 3x improvements in productivity and started saying yes to their businesses? Would that make a difference to your organizations, to your group, to you? This stuff matters. Now, you may not believe this is possible, but listen to this. In 2007, I had the opportunity to take over development for the LaserJet business firmware. It had been the bottleneck for the organization for over 2 decades. We couldn't add a new product to our plans that we were going to release without checking to see if we had capacity and firmware resources. Marketing had almost given up asking for anything new. We tried to spend our way out of a problem. We'd grown over to $100 million a year that we were spending on firmware development, and we still couldn't get out of the business's way. It was the bottleneck for the business, and we couldn't get anything done. Within 3 years, we dramatically changed that. We changed our architecture, we changed our approach, we changed our development processes, and within 3 years, we had some pretty dramatic results. Firmware was no longer the bottleneck for the business. Products could be added at will and supported as many. The bottleneck shifted to the mechanical engineering sort of part of the supply chain, and it was no longer firmware for the first time in 2 decades. Development costs went from 100 million to 50 million. Think about it. In 2007, we started this. In 2008, anybody remember 2008? There was a lot of money floating around, everybody was spending money. It may surprise you, but the first thing on everybody's mind in 2008 was not which new LaserJet printer I should go buy. And because of that, we didn't have the money in the business to fund what we had been funding and what we had been doing. I needed to come up with a plan in 30 days to reduce my development costs by 50 to 60%, or 40 to 50%. And in 30 days came up with that plan and started doing the transformation. At that time, I was looking for anything possible to improve the productivity of the organization and improve the productivity of the business. And through the changes that we made, we were able to support 140% more products. And the capacity for innovation went from 5% of what we were doing to 40%. Pretty dramatic breakthroughs. What's interesting is as I go look at most organizations that I'm starting to work with and seeing how they're doing development, things look and feel more like the LaserJet business before the transformation than after. And there are some really good organizations doing some really good breakthrough work, and you'll hear Gene Kim talk about them as unicorns. These are people that are doing continuous delivery, ongoing basis, and those types of things. And it's interesting to hear the stories of what they've done and how they've done it. But most of them started small doing software development well and grew very big because of it. It is hard to find very many organizations that have made the transition from traditional ways of doing development to more modern technologies and modern approaches to developing software and gotten the productivity improvements that are possible. These transitions are hard and they're not done well. As Gene likes to say, people get tired of hearing about unicorns. The horses get tired of hearing about unicorns because while it's interesting and it's aspiring, it's hard to imagine how you would get there. And what I'd like to share with you is a story or an approach that you can use to help transform your organization to get from where you are with the traditional to leading edge. If you're already doing the leading edge stuff, there's not a lot you're going to learn here. But the problem is the people doing the leading edge work, the unicorns, are only representing about 5% of the people out there. So what about the rest of the people? I talk a lot about applying Agile principles at scale as opposed to scaling Scrum. What do I mean by that? Everybody's seen the classical view of waterfall development where you check requirements and you deal with that. And I think we all know that people came up with something different because we realized that wasn't working. You can fix the resources and the scope, and what happens is when you're not meeting schedule, you tend to slip the schedule, or you tend to, whip the horses until they're sort of beat and wear out the resources to do that. And at the business level, I think the paradigm shift for Agile was, how do we release more frequently? How do we do smaller iterations? How do we get products in front of customers much quicker so we can do a lot of the lean ideas of getting the feedback and responding and getting the reaction to those changes and doing that? But what happened when they took Agile out of the small businesses that were as effective, where definition of done made sense, and moved it into the enterprise, people lost track of enterprise frequent releases and getting it in front of the customers, and everybody focused on what it meant to be the scrum and do that. And if there's one thing you take away from this talk, in the enterprise, scrum does not equal Agile. If you look at any of those things at the enterprise level that we're trying to do, which is having a prioritized backlog, working through things in that order and delivering on a frequent basis, what of that is going to come out of a scrum team? Eventually, if you do SAFe or some of those other methodologies, you will get to where you're solving the enterprise level problems. But if you're not careful, you'll end up with water scrum fall. And to me, one of the interesting things coming from HP, going to Macy's and doing those different things, was when I got more involved in the Agile community and started monitoring, seeing what was being done, everybody was talking about Scrum. And we really didn't do that. We started at the enterprise level applying these principles of scale and trying to do that. And what we realized is we got 2 to 3x productivity improvements. And we had some teams that had chosen on their own to do burn-ups and burn-down charts and stand-ups and stories and all those sorts of things. We had others that were working in a more traditional means. We didn't see a dramatic productivity difference between how the teams operated. But when we looked at solving the enterprise problems, we saw dramatic breakthroughs and huge improvements. And I've had this debate with Joe several times, and really, in the enterprise, the inefficiencies that exist, the team is kind of a second-order effect. How all the teams work together is more of a first-order effect. And I think people miss that because they're focused on what worked in a small business and growing that into a larger organization, instead of looking back at the strong principles that were created in the first place for Agile and applying those at scale. So if there's anything you walk away with this from, is how do you think differently about applying the principles, and just don't go off and implement Scrum and the teams and try to scale from that. How would I recommend starting? I would strongly recommend you don't do Agile. I would strongly recommend you don't do Devops. I would strongly recommend you don't do Lean. Start with your business objectives. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to change in the business? What are you hoping to make happen? This is going to be a long journey. It's going to take effort. It's going to be a lot of change management. If you don't have a vision that rallies the people around it, and you don't have some business results that you're trying to deliver, it's going to be really hard to get the organization to make this transformation, change the behaviors, and work on that. So I would always say start with your business objectives, and as much as possible, you need your executives engaged in that process of picking those and selecting them. The next thing that's important, and you'll see this at the team level on Agile implementations, they do retrospectives, they do learnings, they do evolutions. At HP, we did not do a 3-year plan. We set off to improve things 1 month at a time, and we'd set our objectives and we'd figure it out at the executive level. Now, if you're a team and you had a backlog and you're working on things, you could work on those in priority order and work through them. But if we had an enterprise level of objective, you needed to work on that first, and that aligned the organization across everything. And then really our roles as executives was to help set the business objectives, help set the objectives for the iteration, and then spend our time as investigative reporters trying to figure out what was getting done and what wasn't getting done. And it was all that time out in the organization, learning from the organization, that really drove the changes that we made in the business and the results that we got. Next thing is really applying DevOps and Agile DevOps principles at scale. So if you think about it, how do you release an entire enterprise system like Macy's that's tied to a bunch of different organizations across everything? How do you make that work in a very large organization? That's not going to naturally come out of a small Agile team because it's a very big and complex problem. And if you look at implementing things like continuous delivery, I've had to go back and forth with Jez on a lot of coaching and sort of where do you start, how do you start, how do you get that going, how do you make that transformation? And it's hard and it's complex in a very large business, and hopefully I can describe a little bit about how to break that problem down and simplify it, and what are some of the principles to prioritize the work and go after things. And then lastly, at the enterprise level, you're going to need a prioritized backlog if you're going to be delivering the most valuable things first and working on them in order and delivering those on an ongoing basis. By business objectives at HP, we did not set out to do Agile. We set out to transform our business. We started off with understanding our cost drivers and our cycle time drivers, and we understood our value proposition and what we were trying to deliver. Our goal was 10x productivity improvements, to unleash the vintage chart, which is to no longer be a bottleneck for the business, and to free up capacity for innovation. And given that we had those, and that was everything driving every month's objectives of what we're trying to accomplish, we achieved that. If I set off to do lean, would I have achieved lean? Would I have had these business results? You need to understand what's driving it and use that as your guide. And then anything that gets in your way that's not part of your value proposition, that's a cost driver or a cycle time driver, you need to automate, eliminate, or get rid of. The next thing is this idea of, at the executive level, you need to be driving a continuous improvement process. Your strategy as a business strategy is not an aggregate of all the teams. Your continuous improvement process can't be an aggregate of all the teams. Yes, they should be learning and they should be getting better and they should be figuring that out, but the executive staff should also be doing the same thing, and they should be spending the time out in the organization figuring out what's working and what's not working so they can figure out how to help and what additional investments need to be made to help the organization be more productive. We had metrics behind everything we were doing at HP, and within 40 minutes of walking in, I could figure out exactly what was going on, to the individual that brought something in that broke a certain amount of tests and how that was going. And I spent my whole day wandering around trying to learn what was working and what wasn't working. And it was, you know, Insel, what did you do to break the, or why didn't you get this done? And it wasn't, why didn't you get this done? It was, you thought you could get this done. Why didn't it get done this time? What got in the way? What was the problem? What was figuring that out? And as executive, that's your role, is to go out into the organization and learn what's working and what's not working so you can figure out what to fix, and then use that for your next iteration to figure out how to get better. I have not seen very many organizations that the executives are leading that type of change. And I think if you're going to be successful doing this, you need the executives that are engaged in driving and leading the change. And that's my biggest frustration with coming to conferences like this. Is a lot of times the engineers get trained, they get excited, they go back in the organization, and then the wet blankets come out and smother the enthusiasm. So the key challenge is, how do you get the executives excited and engaged and ready to lead the change? The next thing is on the planning process. I think this is an interesting curve. I think people who've been in software development their whole life get this, that you realize that if you're trying to do long-range plans, they're not going to be very accurate. But executives that have broader businesses that are used to managing everything else they do with waterfall want to invest more and more energy to try to get more and more accurate plans. And the interesting thing about software is it really doesn't get that accurate. And then the other thing that's interesting that, you know, Jez has pointed out well in his new book with his team there is 50% of everything developed is either never used or doesn't meet the business intent. So if you're making a commitment a long ways out in the future, you're locking in capacity to something that's not likely to be used. What happens most in traditional organizations is their executives drive for more and more accurate plans longer in the future. So they're taking their most flexible resource and they're locking it in as a fixed asset to deliver features that'll never be used. When you look at it from that perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense, But if you think about it, they try to manage every other part of the business. Why should this be different? And in reality, organizations can't live without long-range commitments. But if you can look back at the previous curve and say, okay, if I can get reasonably accurate over there with a small investment, and my long-range commitments are only using up 50% of my capacity, at HP, we still had to commit to delivering LaserJet printers, and they had a 2-year manufacturing to get that set up, but we didn't spend our time investing there, 50% of our capacity, so that was a low investment in planning to commit to it. And then as we got into closer in cycles, we'd lock in more of our capacity. The final 20, 30% of our capacity was all based on delivery. We really didn't plan it. We were able to look at our backlog and some different things. So fundamentally changing how you do planning to be more agile in the enterprise is a pretty big shift for most organizations, and it's hard to get executives there. But it's also one of the biggest inefficiencies in most organizations, so it needs to be addressed. This is a flow conference. I'm going to spend most of my rest of the time on the whole applying DevOps principles at scale and focusing in on that area. And the business objectives, I went back and forth with Jez several times in this transformation at Macy's, and for a while we were trying to do continuous delivery, and we were working on the wrong things in the wrong order, and we were trying to get some different things done. And we really had to step back to what we were really trying to do is increase the quality and frequency of feedback to developers. We were trying to do it in an operational-like environment as much as possible so that all the things that had to be done to get it to flow all the way up to the customer were covered. And it was a new change for a lot of the developers because before then, their role was to sign off a story on their desktop or in a dedicated environment, but that didn't mean that it worked with all the rest of the code and could flow out to the customers. And we really worked on reducing the time from release branch to in production, and we tried to improve the consistency, repeatability of our processes and our environmental stability. One of the things I get in a lot of debates with Jez about is, how long should that feedback take and how long should the testing take? And he's like, okay, so 10 minutes. Well, maybe it can go to 15 minutes. Well, at HP, we were more at 4 hours. And I get this large organization transformation, and you talk to places like Google who have a lot of automated tests, and it goes really quickly, and they can get that feedback. And I've wrestled with why is this so hard for traditional organizations, and why is it different, and what does it mean? And a lot of organizations couldn't use continuous delivery because their customer base wouldn't accept it, but the feedback that you get from having a more stable code base is important. So if you look at what's different, a lot of organizations can get by with unit testing. A lot of more traditional organizations need more system testing. So if you think about Facebook versus somebody developing a medical device, the cost of a failure is much different. If you're doing a Facebook device and a widget doesn't work, that's one thing. If you're doing a medical device, it could be a case of life or death. Are you going to want a traditional organization that's doing medical devices to use the same release process as Facebook? Or are you going to want to think about that differently? Ease of deployment. If you look at a lot of the unicorns in the world, they have control over their deployment, and so the trade-off of how quickly do you roll back and how quickly you're able to do that makes a big difference, so you could take a little more risk. If you're looking at a LaserJet printer, it can be a year before an IT department would be willing to roll out a change. And so you have to think about what kind of business you're in. How representative of your production environment is your test environment? If you're developing embedded stuff for cars, and you're running 10,000 tests a day, you're not going to have a bunch of cars in the parking lot driving around in circles. You're going to have to do emulators and simulators and work your way through that process. But Google, on the other hand, can afford a test environment that looks like their production environment, so it's easier to be more of a unicorn. And then the last one is if you have a really clean architecture, like some of these organizations, you see most organizations that are being unicorns have started small and effective and have grown very big quickly because they're more effective in terms of their software development practices. What you see is a lot of organizations that I've worked around have an architecture that look a little more like the one on the right. And it's hard to rely solely on unit tests for that, so you have to figure out how to break up your unit tests, your system tests, get feedback, and keep things going on a maintainable, stable platform. The other piece you're trying to do is one of the biggest benefits is you're trying to give feedback quickly. If you have long release cycles and you have long testing cycles, a lot of what you're trying to do in the end game is figure out who in the organization in the last 6 weeks brought in code that broke something. And you spend a lot of time trying to go through this process of narrowing it down, and you have your debug, you have your triage person trying to figure that out, and eventually you get down to, Ansel, did you break this? It looks like your code broke this about 6 weeks ago. To which he says, are you sure it was me? I think Jez was in the code. Why wasn't it Jez? And you go through that whole process, and you're trying to nail it down. And so what you're trying to design with your DevOps system is the ability to localize it to the fewest number of people possible as quick as you can. Because if I'm going to Ansel 6 weeks later as a manager, I'm just beating him up. If I go to him an hour after he developed the code, I'm making him a better developer. So do you want your system to make your developers better developers? The biggest part of the breakthrough in the metrics at HP came down to making the developer a better developer. It didn't come back from cost savings from automated tests and all those sorts of things. You need those to make the developer a better developer, but you need that feedback and it needs to be real time. Okay, so you've got a very large enterprise system. So Macy's has a bunch of stuff that's waterfall, that's COBOL on AIX systems. You have other things that's more Java-based systems. You put them together, and you've got this idea that you want to stand up as much of the enterprise system as often as you possibly can because you're trying to localize finding the offending code as quick as you can. There's really two approaches to doing that. One is frequency. So you have people committing code. How frequently do you need to develop it to get it down to the fewest number of people? And the other is localizing. So how can you localize and isolate components? Ideally, the first thing you're going to do on any component is you're going to want to unit test it and make sure it works efficiently well. But if you've got large organizational changes over time, you may want to separate out parts of your organization. You may want to take the more waterfall parts of your process and isolate them so that you can not slow down your agile development processes and they can get real-time feedback and you can get feedback on the actual code, not your ability to put together a complete test system and make it work. But even if you do this on a regular basis, once a day, once every other day, you're still going to want to take that mock out because you want to avoid mocks wherever possible because they're expensive to maintain and there could be differences, but they're very effective at breaking down large organizations. It enables different organizations to move at different speeds and make that work, but you still need to be putting them together on a regular basis to make sure something hasn't broken. This is very effective for working, Macy's has IT in Atlanta. We have more of an agile organization on the West Coast. We can isolate that so different parts of the organization can be responsible for their piece and different responsibilities of the organization can be responsible for their piece. So if you think about driving behaviors and keeping the code base always stable and always releasable, if you can isolate and build up the system in a systematic way, that's going to be important to moving forward and moving quickly. The next thing that's interesting is, I call it the religion of green builds. How do you get the organization to own making sure that works and making sure it's there? And there's different approaches. You can, when you're starting with a small team, you can have a chicken and check in the code and wait for it to go green and people can stick around. When you get the larger organization, you can create roles and sort of responsibilities and do those different things. At HP, we finally ended up with a process where if you didn't pass what we'd call a build acceptance test, the code didn't make it into the SCM. So instead of the organization having the responsibilities to run around and chase down the developer that broke it, make sure people were keeping it green, the code just didn't get into the SCM, so it didn't get into trunk. So then everybody's job was that, how do I get my code in versus how do I keep trunk stable? And trunk was always stable. And when you did a refresh, all the developers were getting a stable code base that they were able to work on, which was another step that made them more productive. The other thing is you're starting to build up a very large enterprise. You may have to gate some things at the SCM, but there's this trade-off between the time it takes to get the code into the SCM versus the amount of how big of the enterprise system can you put together and how long can that last. So at some point you may want to start gating at the artifact The challenge with gating at the artifact is how do you get the organization to take ownership for getting that fixed as a top priority to get their latest code into the enterprise system. The nice thing about gating at the SCM is it's automatic and it always works and it forces them to go in. The other side of this is if you do this, you're more gating at the artifact, and while you have train wrecks, you may have it on one track, but who's responsible for getting that unstuck? And the biggest thing I can say is most of these transformations, 30, 40% technology, 60, 70% is about organizational change management. So how do you think of organizational change management as your most precious commodity? And if there's possibilities and opportunities to have your tools reinforce the changes in behavior you want, you should take advantage of them. The other thing, when you start getting into continuous delivery, it was an eye-opener for me going from LaserJets to Macy's, because LaserJet, you know, operations was FTP to the printer, and I got to Macy's and they were deploying code, and I was like, what do you mean it didn't work? You told the code to go over there, it didn't go over there and come up and work. So what would happen is we'd configure our environments, we'd deploy our code, we'd run a bunch of system tests. A system test would fail. Well, we'd go into this and go, okay, now I got to do a debug and triage and figure out whether it was code, whether it was an environment, or whether it was a deployment issue and a failure. So as we've rolled out continuous delivery, we've really worked into validating the environment as it's provisioned. And then as we deploy the code, what's everything possible that we can find out about that deployment and test to validate that that code successfully deployed onto that server and it's running and configured correctly. Then when you get down to the end, you're actually validating code. So similar to the frequency of the builds and building up the systems to try to localize an issue, here we're trying to apply the same principles, but we're trying to separate and localize environment, deployment, and code. And fundamentally, when you architect and roll this out, you've got to think through these issues. So this is a big opportunity. There's a reasonably good framework for thinking about it. I think the biggest challenge is finding a passionate executive in the organization that's willing to lead the transformation. And it's got to be somebody that the organization is willing to follow. One of my most interesting experiences moving over to Macy's is I felt like I knew what needed to happen, but it took me over a year to build up enough credibility that the organization would start to follow. That's a long lead time in the transformation process. And as you start to work with other organizations that are going to do this, if you bring somebody in from the outside, that's going to take a while. Where's the natural leader in the organization that they're willing to follow? These results are possible. What's your plan? What are you going to do to help transform your organization? Appreciate everybody's time. Have a good afternoon.